Let me begin the session by saying how delighted we are to have the opportunity to welcome to this forum a top-level panel of senior finance officials to discuss the future drivers of regional growth. And to moderate this panel, we are lucky once again, and I do mean lucky, once again, to have attracted Shawn Donnan, the world trade editor of the Financial Times, and we anticipate a wonderful conversation with this panel. If you're not following Shawn on Twitter or the social media or reading him in the Financial Times, you need to be. He is really, really good, and it's our pleasure to have him here moderating our panel. Ladies and gentlemen, Shawn Donnan.
That's very kind, Eric. Thank you very much. I guess I've got to buy Eric a drink later. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm also really excited to be here in a kind of breaking news environment. I think there's been big news out of the region today as well, while we're upstairs having a delightful lunch, and we'll address some of that in our chat here today. But really here to talk with three great minds on what's going on in the global economy. My goal, as I told these guys behind it, and before we go any further, I need to clear something up. Philippe came on the stage in crutches. That's not my fault. I wasn't because I was beating him up back there, but he's been very good to move around. My goal here is to really have a frank and open and fun discussion about what's going on in Latin America in terms of growth today. We've got some great themes to attack. My goal is also at some point to get these guys to disagree up here, although probably politely at some point. And we've all agreed that while we're up here, we're going to keep it on a first name basis and so on. So David, I thought I'd start with you, and it's kind of, we're in your hometown. Thank you so much for hosting us here. I'll just get you to turn on your microphone. We're at this. We just had the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank here a few weeks ago, and there's this feeling that we're at this kind of really amazing moment in the global economy where for the first time we've got coordinated kind of growth all over the world in terms of regions, but at the same time some risks out there. And so I just want to, from your view over at the Treasury Department, when you look south and you look out there, what are you seeing right now in terms of the regional economy? Let's start with that.
Well, thanks, Shawn, and it's nice to see a lot of old friends here today, so welcome to Washington. It's very encouraging that world growth has picked up. U.S. growth in particular has picked up, and we're pleased with the economic reforms that we're undertaking in the U.S., including the tax reform, the energy reforms, trade reforms, and especially regulatory reforms. And so those are beginning to work, and I think there's more available there. On a global basis, then, we think that structural reforms around the world offer the availability of faster growth than what the world has been through in these recent years. So as far as vulnerabilities, then, I don't want to name too many, but in general terms, one of the challenges is the buildup of debt, and that's the reach for yield. If you have a successful world, it makes it possible to finance more and more projects. So the challenge, as we see it, is to pick good projects, and especially for the private sector, to be careful in picking projects that actually add value and can have a good return on investment. China, of course, has created a new challenge for developing countries by lending very heavily, often in a non-transparent way, and I've spoken a lot about that in recent months. That as they go into a country, often they're not selecting projects that are going to be all that successful or needed by the people of the country, and the country is left with the debt without very much growth to go with it. And so that's one of the challenges. We've encouraged China, of course, to become a member of the Paris Club, to become transparent. The IMF is working on a big project, and they talk about it in global terms to get transparency of debt and sustainability of debt. But in many ways, it's It's with China in mind because of the magnitude of the misallocation of capital that's coming out of their lending programs.
Marcello, if we just come to you quickly, obviously I want to hear the view from Brazil, but it's at this moment where we have kind of this fascinating change in the last couple of years in attitudes towards openness and of economies, and we've seen that in Brazil, we've seen that in places like Argentina as well. But just when you're looking out at the world right now, what are you seeing?
Thanks so much. First of all, I would like to thank the Council of Americas for the invitation. I mean, this is a place that is very geographically dear to my heart. My first job when I finished my PhD was across the street at the Federal Reserve Board. So it's nice to be back here at the neighborhood from a very young Marcello, now an old guy. But I would say that, let me just begin by agreeing with David that the world is in this kind of nice spot. We have several sources of growth. You have the US economy doing quite well. And again, I have to say good things about the Fed, since I just said that it's my first job out of graduate school. Has done a great job, shepherding this economy toward what's basically full employment with very little inflation. That's remarkable. So it's a remarkable job, and that's a big service that it's doing for the world economy. So that's the first thing. I mean, I see a very healthy US economy, and not that worried about it. I mean, you're getting to the peak of the cycle, but this peak can last quite a while. And again, policymakers have been doing a great job keeping that way. I see strength elsewhere in the world. For Latin America, what I see is an increasing demand for what Latin America produces most, which are commodities. So that's another thing. I mean, when you look at Latin America, you have to, of course, you all know that, but it's a quite diverse continent. So you have the western part, say, of South America, which are pretty much commodity producers, open economies, part of the Pacific Alliance. They are doing quite well, but they face some slowdown during the world global financial crisis. You have in the eastern part, you have Brazil, Argentina, big economies. Brazil is like half of Latin America, half of South America in terms of GDP and population. So those countries are coming from deeper recessions, in particular Brazil. In 2015-16, we had the worst measured recession of our history. But what's very interesting about that episode is that was a recession that I would call a developed economy recession. We didn't have one problem of balance payments. Brazil is actually long dollars. There was no bank failure. It was basically a crisis of confidence on a fiscal policy that was not sustainable. And we are getting out of it. So you have basically, you have space to grow. That's what I mean. We have space to go, in particular in Brazil. In the parlance of economists, the output gap is quite wide in Brazil. We have a very credible monetary policy framework. We have a fiscal adjustment that is in train. And then when you see now the turbulence that you've seen this week, basically didn't affect Brazil. There was some depreciation of the currency. But, we have very low inflation, 2.7% inflation. Market expecting Brazil to grow about 3%. So I would say it is a good time for the world economy.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that turbulence before long. Philippe, you've got this, I always think of the IFC, you've got a big building over there on Pennsylvania Avenue, but you sort of hide away. Sometimes I think of the IFC, and you do, but you also have this amazing kind of view into private sector or around the world. When you look at Latin America now, what are the kind of the big trends that you see in the private sector there, and how does that make you think about growth in the region?
Well, thank you, and first of all, let me thank Sigal and Eric for this invitation. I mean, this is we joined your group last year, and this is an integral part of our new strategy, which is to partner much more in a much more dynamic way with all kind of other organizations to help us deliver on our mission. And on the mission, we want to change from being reactive. In other words, IFC typically was financing what an investor project, to proactive, which means to go and create our own projects, our own markets, and then bring in the investors. That's just an introduction. I'm not answering your question. I'm getting there, Shawn. And on Latin America, if you look at the history of Latin America, it has been boom and burst, and driven by commodities. So we come out now of a very low growth, the decade of 2010, if you want. It's commodity. The issue is how do you get beyond commodities? I think this is a very hard question. And for me, one key issue in Latin America, and I agree with Marcello, it's very hard to make generalities. So it's a few, but the productivity is the name of the game. Productivity is low, competitiveness is not very good. I mean, 20% of export is one of the region in the world that exports the least, and that's a pretty good barometer of competitiveness, and obviously linked to productivity. If you look beyond the productivity, you have not very good score on the PISA test, which is the education system. It is not delivering for the masses. I mean, yes, you have elites, but on the masses, the level is also quite low compared to other regions. And then there is a problem of connectivity. Some call it regional integration, but I don't know, roads. I mean, I read the statistic that 60% of the roads are not paved. That compared to half in ECA and other emerging regions, this is not a very good number. So ports, airports, roads, trains, I mean, I think that's in infrastructure, there's a huge amount to be done. I was in Colombia a few months back, and I was flabbergasted to discover that to go from the capital to the coast, it's more expensive to send a truck there than sending a boat from the port all the way to China. I mean, so clearly, I mean, infrastructure is a huge another impediment that we have to crack. So the impediment can become the driver of growth. So you have to fix them. So I think that we need to push more on private solution for infrastructure. Why? Because you don't want to add more debt on the government books that are in some cases already stretched. And that's the Colombia story, for example. We have to do the same in Argentina right now. So that is one thing. We believe that there's a strong, very interesting things that are happening on the financial side, financial inclusion, thanks to fintech. So we'll continue to follow that. We believe that high tech we have only five unicorns in all Latin America, which is better than ECA, but not close to South Asia or East Asia. But I think there's a huge potential there. Education, I think that there is now very interesting experiment, again, using technology to increase very rapidly the level of education and to penetrate and to use private solutions too. Otherwise, you don't want to wait a generation for a new education cycle. So these are the kind of things that we'd like to follow up and do more of. The financial sector is a little bit underdeveloped, we find, and financing SMEs has not been that easy. In fact, credit to GDP ratio is 47%. Again, that's compared to in emerging market an average of 80%, so we're below that average. So I think we're talking about Argentina. I was reading the statistics. It's domestic credit to GDP 6%. This is really totally underdeveloped, and we need to develop the capital markets to improve resource allocation and find a local destination for the savings and local currency solutions. A lot of the debt is external because there's not a local capital market that can finance infrastructure, but also other businesses. So these are a few challenges, but the way I see it, challenges are opportunities and driver for growth in the future.
Okay. As I mentioned, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, but as I mentioned, as we were having lunch or heading into lunch upstairs, Mauricio Macri down in Argentina went on television and announced that Argentina had requested assistance from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Since last week, when Argentina raised rates really 40% to 40%, we've been watching what's been happening with the peso and other emerging market currencies. You referenced the turbulence, Marcello. I wonder if, and I'll start with you, David. I mean, first of all, are we looking at the beginnings of another emerging market crisis?
I don't think we're looking at that, but I do want to say the Trump administration has been very supportive of President Macri and the economic reform program, which has been market-oriented, private sector growth focused, and has been improving the situation in Argentina. So as they discuss, it's on the foundation of the right vision, and so we'll be watching the discussions very closely. But I don't think there's a reason to be talking about it as an emerging market. As Marcello pointed out, Brazil's not seeing very much of the weakness, and overall the global growth environment is favorable for economic reforms.
Marcello, do you want to jump in?
The name of the game is institutional development. That's what we are talking about. Remind me of the crisis we had in Brazil in 1997, and we learned from that. Actually, if I just give an example based on the Brazilian experience, since we defeated inflation in the mid-90s, there has been a continuing institutional development in the country. So when it comes to times like that, it's not a crisis at all, actually, because we have an independent central bank. It's not de jure, de facto. We have low inflation. Inflation in Brazil is 2.7%. We have a fiscal adjustment that is credible, that is in train. So that gives you basically the fundamentals to face any crisis. We are about to have an election in Brazil. You know, Brazil is the second largest democracy in the Western Hemisphere after the US. And we are going to have an election that people thinking very differently, many different candidates. Markets get a bit concerned because some candidate is like this, the other is like that. But, you know, the bottom line is whoever is the president is going to probably finish the job that we started with a social security reform that Brazil needs very badly, so we can complete the fiscal adjustment that we are doing. What we did right now in Brazil was we did a fiscal adjustment, we conduct monetary policy responsibly, and now we are in great macroeconomic shape. But in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the pressure from the social security system is going to be really very large. So that's what we need in Latin America. We need to continue reforms and keep an eye on the ball, and it's a long game. And that's what Brazil has been doing.
Yeah, so for those of us who watched the emerging markets crises in the late 1990s, we all became very familiar with the word contagion. We all remember crises starting in one place and spreading. Do you worry at all about Argentina's problems spreading through the region, again, through no fault of your own, but simply through investor sentiment?
Certainly not to Brazil. Because I mean, we have a lot of reserves. Brazil's long dollar. We are a member of the Paris Club. I mean, our banks are very strong. The economy is well managed. Again, we have structural problems which are serious and need to be dealt with, and we are dealing with them. And now it's an electoral year, so what we need is for the next president to continue the work that we have been doing since the middle of 2016. And this Brazilian society is mature enough, and we've seen that even in the end of the previous government, when there was a true intention to do a fiscal adjustment, but you know they couldn't do for other reasons. The society is mature. We don't like high inflation. We don't like fiscal responsibility. We're just trying to find a way to make that really a policy for the long run. That's why I focus on social security reform. It's hard in any country. It's hard to do in Brazil as well. but the next president needs to do it. The moment we do that, then we are talking about a big upside for Brazil. I think the discussion now in Brazil is, are we going to grow 2 to 3% for the next 5 to 10 years, or are we going to go 4 to 5? To go 4 to 5, we need to have, again, a good fiscal dynamics, which depends on Social Security reform. We need to continue having the fiscal policy that we are having right now of fiscal austerity and caution. We need to continue having independent monetary authority. And that's, again, why I think there's no contagion happening. And by the way, I'm talking about Brazil, but you look at other countries in the region, it's the same. I could be talking about Chile, about Peru, about Colombia. And actually, the fact that Argentina is going to ask for the IMF help is just a testimony of the importance of multilateralism and the importance of these international organizations, because they are the ones that are ready to step in with a consistent framework and with the support of the whole international community to help a country that, like David said, is trying to turn around the situation.
Philippe, I've got to ask the same question of you. You've been around a long time working with emerging markets and developing economies. Do you see the conditions out there for a crisis?
No, I don't see an emerging market crisis. What we see is a kind of localized issue, but that will be a business as usual almost, but it has to be contained. What I am a bit more worried is the poorest countries, which is mostly not Latin America, where in fact we see debt going back to the pre-HIPC time, and that may be unsustainable. So we need to be able to shift the way we think about delivering projects and shifting to the private sector. I'm barking after my own tree in IFC, but we believe we are part of the solution. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, be ready in case there is a need for debt restructuring. But as David said, I mean, the first step is transparency on the numbers, both on the debt side and the borrowing side. And that, I think that we made the first step as with the IMF. We need to do much better. So that's my view. And for me, Latin America, I mean, again, Marcello, I mean, that's our analysis also. I mean, the key word is institutions, and structural reforms. The macro, there was macro instability. I think that Latin America has learned the lessons. We've seen that. And it's pretty much under control. The structural reforms, which is much deeper, and you go into, there are vested interests. There's a reason why the structure of an economy is like it is. This has to continue. They have good examples around Latin America, but it has to continue. And the key for successful reforms is to never stop. So that is something we're going to watch and never stop and encourage. And if the IMF and as a program, I'm sure they're going to see that, because long are past the days where they were purely an accounting macro framework. They go more and more on the supply side, where in fact the bank and now AFC will give recommendations on what to do. For me, it's expansion of the private sector, but for that we need a public sector that works.
Marcello, I just want to come back to you quickly. I mean, one of the themes we've mentioned already that we've seen in the last couple of years is this kind of change in attitudes towards the opening up of economies, towards trade, and so on. Do you worry at all? I mean, the politics of the IMF in Argentina have been fraught for a long time. The IMF in Latin America, the politics have been fraught for a long time. Do you worry at all that this shock or the IMF episode, the new episode with Argentina, could turn the politics at all in Latin American countries like yours?
Again, no, I don't think so, because what's happening in Argentina is a macroeconomic crisis, which I'm not even sure is that serious. So let's see what's going to happen. So doesn't go to the core of what the current government in Brazil and the Macri government are trying to do. I talk about reforms. I mean, we've done in a year and a half a lot of reforms. We passed a constitutional amendment in Brazil that limits fiscal spending to the previous year's levels plus inflation, so spending is frozen in real terms. That's why we need a Social Security reform, by the way, to make that ceiling really doable in the long term. We did a labor market reform, making the labor market much more flexible. We've changed the way the credit markets work with much less government direction by making the Brazilian National Development Banking lend at market rates. And we've done many things. Like Philippe said, we need to continue doing those. If you continue doing those, it doesn't matter if there is a little bit of a noise here or noise there. I mean, because these are structural changes. You talked about the opening up of, let's say, Mercosur. It's fundamental that Mercosur is a more open bloc. It's a bloc that is way too removed from what we would call the international global value chains. It needs to integrate better. That's why we are almost finishing a negotiation with the European Union, for instance. And many other countries are looking to have trade agreements with Brazil. We are looking also at how to make the bloc itself better integrated within itself. Maybe it's quite obvious, and you should be better integrated if you created a trade bloc. We are getting closer to our partners of the Pacific Alliance. It's very important as well. So all this, to me, are structural issues. The fact that the IMF is helping, another thing, the IMF is helping Argentina. So it's being a partner in a situation that a country is having problems. I would say it's a good thing. It's not bad for this movement.
David, it's hard to have you here and not ask about China. You're just back from China from this remarkable trip. I call them the Magnificent Seven, but I didn't know you were there as well, who went off to negotiate with the Chinese government on trade. Can you give us a situation report, a readout on where things stand, and what should we expect? Should we expect a grand bargain between the U.S. and China? This is something everyone is paying attention to. Or should we expect these tariffs to go into place and high trade conflict?
Shawn, I'm not going to make news on that with you. Look, what is happening is a high-level dialogue with China on ways to have a more balanced trading environment and one that has more growth for the United States and even more growth for China. And that was the context of the discussions. So there's talk of a return visit, and so I'm encouraged by that. And I think as we think about the world, we should put it into the context of a growing world environment where people are seeking a way to integrate better and in a way that works for workers in the United States. That is President Trump's focus, but that also works for workers around the world. And we're going to continue pushing hard for that. I think there's lots more upside for the world. In Latin America, if I may, we've put forward an America Crece, a growth initiative that is spearheaded by the recognition that there's lots more that can be done in the Western Hemisphere on energy, both in terms of U.S. sales of natural gas, which is now in abundance in the United States and is a very clean source of energy, so more sales of that. But very importantly, more development of the infrastructure in Latin America that can provide more energy to the people and businesses of Latin America. So this is a huge opportunity, upside opportunity for Latin America. And so I don't want to miss that as people focus on other things.
Okay, but there is this. I'm just going to follow up with you quickly. And I mean, one of the issues that the administration has singled out is Chinese investment in strategic sectors here in the United States. And you over at Treasury are working on some new measures to address that. But we've seen Chinese investment in regions around the world, including Latin America. And I wonder, when you look out at Latin America and you see the Chinese playing a growing role there, are you concerned by that? Do you see that as a reason for concern? Is that something that the U.S. needs to counteract or to address in some way?
I mentioned in developing countries, China is often entering with subsidized credit that's not aimed at projects that will actually end up benefiting the people and in a non-transparent way. In the United States, China has identified an industrial policy that seeks to invest and dominate sectors. And so those are issues for really everyone in the world to think about. Europe has expressed concern about some of these same issues, both in terms of the lack of transparency of the debt around the world, and also the aggressiveness of the investments being made into their own economies that don't end up benefiting the people. And so these are things that everyone can work on and can find paths forward to make it work better. And above all, with in mind, and this is something that we share with China, an interest in having a more balanced trade environment and more growth in both countries.
Marcello, we used to talk a lot about the BRICS. I don't hear that term so much anymore. It felt slightly artificial at the time anyway. But I wonder, Brazil is the biggest economy in South America, as you said. How do you look at China and its influence in the region right now?
I think you just have to listen more carefully. We still talk about the BRICS. China is the largest trade partner of Brazil as an individual country. It's a country that is growing fast, has 1.4 billion people, so it's an important partner for Brazil, like the US or the European Union. So the way I would see, at least from the point of view of Brazil, is like we have what I would say at this point in time, a pragmatic approach to foreign economic policy. So we are getting very close, for instance, to the OECD. We actually asked to start the process of accession of Brazil. Brazil has been a key partner since 2007. We abide by most OECD rules and regulations. We have good data for the last 50 years. Actually, Brazil inflation data started in the 1950s. So it's like, anyway, we are basically an OECD country that is not a full-fledged member yet. But at the same time, the BRICS movement is very important for us because you're talking, and as it should be for the US as well, because you're talking about the region of the world between China and India that is growing fast and has among them 2.5 billion people. So this is not something that, so in our mind, it's not like either or, we are excited about Chinese growth. We are doing business with them. We do business with them like the US does. So that scenario that David was talking is not Brazil. We have very, very specific rules how we can invest. We have an auction process, and we stepped up the rules, and it's quite transparent in mid-2016, that anybody, and here I see many firms in the private sector, can bid for oil exploration in Brazil or for construction work. Or anyway, if the Chinese pay the best price, it's certainly not subsidized, it's market price, they're very welcome to come and build using Brazilian rules and the public governance that we're instituting. That's another thing we didn't talk much here, is that what you've seen in Brazil is like really a big improvement in public governance, including because the population has no tolerance anymore for bad public governance. So what we see is people, once they go through the judicial process of investigation and trials, if they are condemned, they go to jail. Doesn't matter if they are ex-presidents or they're big entrepreneurs. So that's another thing that is a movement in Brazil. Again, we are looking at the long game. That is quite important. And so in that context, what we have is we welcome US investment, we welcome Chinese investment, following good governance and following good rules, which are Brazilian, because you are investing in Brazil.
If we can move on to another crisis that was mentioned by Ambassador Haley upstairs, and that's the crisis in Venezuela and so on. Again, that is something that is growing into one that is affecting neighboring countries like Brazil. I wonder, David, how worried are you about that? And we saw a really incredible call from the ambassador upstairs for Maduro to step down, and clearly a very strong call there. But can you walk us through a little bit where you go from here? You've already imposed a lot of sanctions. What's the next step?
Well, of course, very worried about the human catastrophe underway in Venezuela due to a non-democratic process that simply has completely failed the people. So what we want to do, what we've tried to accomplish with the sanctions, is to stop the flow of cash to the illicit regime because that just serves their purposes and maintains them in power, and preserve assets for the Venezuelan people. One thing to keep in mind is if there were a functioning democratic government in Venezuela, there would likely be access to Venezuela's resources, which are huge, and support from the world community. And so we're deeply concerned day by day in what's going on in Venezuela. We recently had a meeting of Friends of Venezuela where there was a sharing of intelligence on what's going on in Venezuela, and one of the singular things is the Venezuelan government, Maduro, is skimming from the food boxes. And so you have this horrible situation that 70% of the value of the box is going into the hands of the government and leaving only a little bit of the food and calories left over for the people of Venezuela. So that was documented by multiple countries working together in Latin America to disclose the criminal network that really is underway, and Ambassador Haley made reference to that criminal network. And so as we as a group think about what can be done, of course, more involvement by Europe in the Vice President Pence yesterday designated 2 more individuals for illegal activities and for looting of Venezuela, and Europe needs to be more active in that process because a lot of the money that's being looted from Venezuela is ending up in Europe and needs to be taken. So, and it's very clear to the U.S. that the people close to Maduro will end up losing both their money, both their ability to have activities around the world because of this regime. And so it needs to be, as Ambassador Haley pointed out, Maduro needs to go. Thanks.
Marcello?
Venezuela is a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, you need to, so as a neighbor and someone in a country that is receiving, and right now we have about 40,000 Venezuelans at the border, and in the case of Brazil, most are really in these small towns in the middle of the Amazonic forest where we have, very little resources there. So we are stepping up the resources sent to the border, and some of these Venezuelans are being able to go to other parts of the country where we have, we have cities, not little villages. So it's a very serious situation. We welcome our sisters and brothers from Venezuela to come when they need to come. I mean, they are, it's a very sad environment. I mean, I see many of you here have white hairs. I remember in the 70s, I was a child. Venezuela was a beacon of democracy in the continent. Venezuela is a rich country. They have one of the largest, if not the largest, oil reserves in the world. So what we are seeing now is a type of socio-economic implosion that is really sad. And we need to do something about it. I don't know what it is. That's not direct part of my portfolio, but it's definitely something very serious. I mean, for Colombia, it's even more. They have about between 600,000, 700,000 Venezuelans in Colombia now. Good part with Colombian passport, because they are the kids that, of parents that fled Colombia during the civil war there. So it's a very serious situation. And we are very worried about and very happy to contribute to what we can for the problem.
Shawn, may I add in? So Western Hemisphere has the opportunity to be democratic as a whole. And so Ambassador Haley mentioned and discussed in some detail the problems in Nicaragua, and we should also, and the interconnectedness of Venezuela with Nicaragua, with Cuba. And so we need to take note also of a transition of power in Cuba that happened without the benefit of the voice of the people. So these are tasks and challenges for the hemisphere that will make it better if they can be surmounted.
So time flies, and we've got about 10 minutes left, according to my clock. So I just want to open it up to the floor a little bit, see if there are any questions on the floor. And if there aren't, then we can talk about baseball.
The World Cup.
The World Cup, Marcello.
Or we can ask you questions.
Oh, no, you don't have any questions for me. Any questions on the floor? No? Oh, we got one right up here in front here. Just wait for the mic so everyone can hear you. It's just coming right here.
Thank you. Hi. We used to talk a lot about financial inclusion in the hemisphere. And Philippe, you talked about fintech helping with that. I mean, where are we going on that? In Brazil, with the IFC, with U.S. Department of Treasury, how are we doing on incorporating more and more people into the formal economies of their nations?
I don't have the exact statistics on the fintech, but I know that it is increasing extremely rapidly. I saw the growth rate from a low base, granted, but we are very hopeful that that will be a massive, it will make a big dent into financial inclusion, because a lot of the population, I forgot the percentage, but a big chunk is unbanked in Latin America, which surprised me when I saw the statistics. And we've seen in other countries, including much poorer countries that we see in Latin America, where, for example, in Bangladesh, in a matter of years, we had the company in which we invested that went from 0 to 25 million customers. It goes very fast. Granted, this is not necessarily important to make a loan or whatever, but just having a mean of transferring money, it's very powerful. So we have good examples, and we believe this is because that was a question. What are you following up as trend? This is a trend we're following up and encouraging. We're proactive. We're not waiting around. So we are very, very, very hopeful that fintech is going to grow, continue to grow very fast in Latin America.
So the Council of the Americas runs a very, very tight ship, and I'm told Secretary Perry is here now, and therefore we're going to bring an end to the session. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. If you can join me in thanking them. Thank you.